Our topic today is John Henrik Clarke, Master Psychiatrist. Professor John Henrik Clarke was my teacher, my mentor, and hero at Hunter College. He was my instructor for 16 of the credits I took in my Black Studies major. He influenced every aspect of my life, what I named my children, where I live, where I work, everything. My daughter's named Asantewa because Professor Clarke taught me about the warrior queen Yaa Asantewa. My oldest son is named Tayari in honor of both Kabili Tayari and Tayari Cassell, but also because Tayari means prepared or ready. And Dr. Clarke taught us that we should have nation-building skills and be prepared. My youngest son, Malefi, has the middle name Henrik because Dr. Clarke had changed his own middle name from Henry to Henrik. I worked at Harlem Hospital because Dr. Clarke suggested I work at Harlem Hospital when I asked him where I should do residency when I completed medical school. I met Professor Clarke as one of the students involved in the struggle to form the Department of Black and Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College and the struggle to bring Professor Clarke there as a faculty member. There were some very heavy students there, and my job in that struggle was more muscle than mental. I was recently back at the college from Vietnam, and student leaders would tell me to stand by a door and look ugly as we sat in and laid siege to various offices in that college. In the course of that struggle, my consciousness was raised, and I eventually changed my major from mathematics to Black Studies, right there in the department that we had forced the college to form. Dr. Clarke surprised me one day by asking me to come to a conference that was being held by the education department of state. And this invitation was expressing me a confidence that I certainly did not yet have in myself. And I argued with him that there were far more intellectually powerful students to represent the department, students such as James Ollie, Felix Rivera, and Cecilia Clay. And I told him they were eminently more qualified to represent the department than me. But Professor Clarke said, no, I want you to do it. For 3 days at the conference, I didn't say a word. I simply listened in disbelief as I heard and observed the racism of the largely white gathering. Finally, at the last plenary session, which was being taped for a TV program, I was placed on a panel with Professor Clarke, even though I was still saying nothing. Professor Clarke, even though I was still saying nothing, turned to me and said, boy, you can't sit up here for 3 days and say nothing. I said, Professor Clarke, I don't want to say anything to embarrass you. He reassured me that I could let loose without causing him any embarrassment whatsoever. Armed with, at best, only 2 Black Studies courses, I began to light into the racist things that had been said at the conference. The place caught on fire. Some of the other Black folks scattered in the audience and who had been sitting there in silence, just like me up to that point, now jumped in supporting my statements. Soon, some of the white faculty began to direct their fire at me. But I found that with the smattering of Black history information I had, I could easily refute their statements and arguments. Professor Clarke had already taken the time to show me and all the Black students the power of African history at one of our invasions of the college faculty council. It was there that we witnessed Professor Clarke decimate the college's top scholars, telling the math instructors what they did not know about the origin of math, Romance language instructors what they did not know about Russian, Spanish, and French history and literature, as he lit them up with the Moorish invasion, Pushkin, and several generations of the Dumas family, as well as the book Stolen Legacy. So there I was at this conference with my 2 courses, trying to do the same thing and actually doing it. It was like I had a machine gun. I was mowing them down. Soon, some of the big guns at the conference began to fire at me. He shouted, one of them was this dude that got up and said in a thick Germanic accent, you are arrogant, but I just mowed him down. I said, you call me arrogant when a few minutes ago I heard you use the phrase Red China? You, sir, are the epitome of arrogance, calling the People's Republic of China Red China and calling a little island, Taiwan, China. That's like calling mainland United States Red America and calling Manhattan Island, the United States. I looked at Professor Clarke and he was smiling. The Black folks in the audience were laughing. When the real big guns came out, Professor Clarke took over, coolly taking a straight razor out of his jacket pocket. Not a real straight razor, this is a metaphor. He took out his razor and slit every opposing throat in the place. the conference was blown apart. When it was over, everyone was excited and the Black people all gathered around us, and Professor Clarke was beaming like a bear who had just taught his cub to hunt. Now, as Professor Clarke would say when he lectured, I will get to the subject of my lecture. My topic is John Henrik Clarke, Master Psychiatrist. But Professor Clarke is not a psychiatrist, you might say, and I once might have agreed with you, because it was only years after I graduated that I realized what a psychiatrist he was for me personally and what a role he played in my ever becoming a psychiatrist. It was Professor Clarke who taught me about Imhotep, who first introduced me to the work of Fanon, Senghor, and the literature which would lead me to the works of Wright, Akbar, Cambone, Karinga, Asante, Anid, Wilson, Welsing, Nobles, etc. Yes, in retrospect, Dr. John Henrik Clarke was not only a psychiatrist, he was a master psychiatrist. His patient was our people. His technique could be called African cognitive, emotional, and spiritual reconstruction, but he was eclectic enough to use whatever was needed to help his patients, be that psychoanalysis, supportive psychotherapy, behavioral therapy, and even shock therapy when necessary. This topic, John Henrik Clarke, master psychiatrist, is way too large to be covered in the 20 minutes allotted to me here. To treat this subject properly would require thorough scouring of all of Dr. Clarke's writings and speeches. That is a task obviously beyond the scope of today's lecture and too comprehensive and specialized for the purpose, which is a tribute. So today, instead of comprehensively detailing my thesis, I will simply do enough to make my point. Today, I will review with you one presentation of Dr. Clarke from around 1995, which was his debate with Cornel West over nationalism versus whatever it is that Brother West says he believes in. Try as I might, I can never remember what that is. I know that there are words such as Christian, radical, maybe democratic, and something else, which apparently my limited brain refuses to remember or even instruct my hand to write down. In that debate, Dr. Clarke actually on numerous occasions used formal psychological terminology. In that lecture in particular, he used the words ego, guilt, consciousness, conscience, intelligence, natural genius, depression, fantasy, temperament, etc. In several other instances during that debate, Dr. Clarke addressed psychological issues such as sociopathy, manipulation, family dynamics, child development, altruism, object constancy, even developmental stages, autonomy, shame, and doubt, and defense mechanisms without ever announcing that this is what he was doing. Lastly, in this debate, Dr. Clarke demonstrated the use of various psychiatric techniques such as proper timing when making an interpretation, as well as the uses of emotional learning and therapeutic alliance in the treatment of a patient. During his lifetime, Dr. Clarke's patients were 1, our people in general, 2, his audience, and in the case of this debate, 3, Dr. West himself. Certainly this discussion between he and West was more of a therapy than a debate because, as Dr. Clarke pointed out in his infamous confrontation with the European anti-Afrocentrist Mary Lefkowitz, it was not a debate because a debate is between equals. Likewise with Mr. West, Dr. Clarke was never engaged in a debate, but as he pointed out to Lefkowitz, he was engaging what he is always engaged in, which is, quote, World War III, unquote. The debate with West started with Dr. Clarke doing what only he can do so well, which was to give a grand overview of the dynamic between Africans and non-Africans, going all the way back to the Punic Wars. Dr. Clarke discussed the European personality, starting with the Romans during those wars as an example. The term he used was European temperament. Temperament is simply another word for character, and Professor Clarke was showing familiarity here with Leopold Sédar Senghor's work, which postulated certain differences between European and African personalities. He was also demonstrating a familiarity with Dr. Bobby Wright's book, White Psychopathic Racial Personality. Clarke characterizes the period of the Punic Wars as a blown opportunity for Europe to share power and the trade of the Mediterranean Ocean. He described what could be called a sociopathic tendency on the part of Europeans to want and demand it all in any transaction rather than share. He describes it as an example of a tendency dictated by their temperament. Dr. Clarke traces that tendency exhibited during the Punic Wars all the way to the present, where he points out that Europeans use as close to all of the world's resources as they can. Dr. Clarke speaks of the vicious burning of Christians by the Romans, followed by the manipulative conversion of the Romans to Christianity under Constantine to advance their political purposes. The Romans had decided that a religion with only one God was more conducive to getting people to accept the rule of Romans under just one emperor. Clarke further went on to demonstrate the consistency of the European personality when all of the countries in Europe, even under the official label of Christianity, engaged in the obviously immoral and murderous behaviors required for conducting the slave trade. Dr. Clarke, without stating so, demonstrated his knowledge of defense mechanisms when he pointed to the Europeans' use of the defense mechanism rationalization to overcome the small moral hurdle of justifying slavery and murder, even when ostensibly saddled with religion, which they alleged taught the brotherhood of man. Clarke explains in this debate that Europeans simply used the rationale that they weren't slaving and murdering for profit, but they were doing so to save souls and convert heathens to Christianity. Dr. Clarke points out how the Pope, Alexander VI, drew a line down the middle of the earth and said that the Portuguese had the right to render persons unto servitude on one side of that longitudinal line, and the Spaniards had the right to do it on the other side. Dr. Clarke contrasts this moral flexibility and manipulativeness and obsessive acquisition of power with African naivete. He then pathologizes that naivete and demonstrates example of that pathology in our interactions, not only with Europeans, but with other non-Africans. He gives the specific examples of African alliances with Muslim Arabs in an effort to escape the yoke of European oppression, only to find themselves later oppressed by the same Arabs. As a psychiatrist, Clarke is speaking of the issue of object constancy. Object constancy refers to the knowledge that a given person is the same person no matter under which circumstances one meets that person. The infant, according to Western psychiatric thinking, has a phase during which he cannot combine the identity of the mother who gratifies him by feeding him and playing with him with the identity of the same mother who sometimes ignores his cries and sometimes fails to gratify him. They say that for a brief period in the infant's development, the infant thinks that his mother is two different people. Now, how did the infant tell European this? We cannot say. But let's suspend our own object constancy for a moment and assume that they would not lie about such a thing. And just take note that Dr. Clarke is utilizing this concept as he critiques the historical childlike naivete of our people, failing to recognize the long-standing modus operandi of non-Africans. He contrasts Europeans consistently and persistently seeking power and control of African resources to this African naivete. Dr. Clarke is harsh in his critique of those such as Dr. West, who feel they will obtain all that they need for liberation by alliances with European and other non-African sociopaths. Dr. Clarke actually infers that they are psychotic. Remember, psychosis is defined as a break with reality. That is, thinking and perceiving things that have no basis in reality. Dr. Clarke does not overtly use the word psychotic, but he describes psychosis perfectly as he says these words to Cornel West, quote, "We have to introduce our people to reality. Oppression has taught us to live in a world of sick political fantasy," unquote. Clarke elaborates on this with several other comments such as, quote, "No one has ever planned our destiny. Any people who think that another people will plan their road to power are fools." Clarke went on to say, quote, "Freedom is something you take with your own hands. You control it with your own hands. You do not leave it to other people or alliances. You first make alliance with yourself. When you make an alliance, you make it on what's convenient. Make it on what works. And when it stops working, you break it." Clarke does not say that his patient, Dr. West, is specifically engaged in a world of sick political fantasy during this debate, but it is obvious to the listeners that he considers West to be of that ilk. By not calling West's name specifically, by speaking indirectly, Dr. Clarke is at one and the same time being respectful of West as an African man, and on the other hand is also using what is generally considered good psychiatric technique. The psychiatrist never makes an interpretation until the patient has in some way indicated he or she is ready for it. The healthy part of the patient will never ally with the therapist or form a therapeutic alliance if the therapist injures the patient with the interpretation. Instead of the healthy part of West allying with Professor Clarke, West attempts to flip the script. He attempts to ally with what he asserts is Dr. Clarke's political past. He attempts to dissociate Clarke from what West might call run-of-the-mill nationalists and paint Clarke as an exception. West addresses the audience directly as he alludes to Clarke's early and even late association with Marxism and communism by asserting, quote, "There is a tendency," said West, "to relate to his," Dr. Clarke's, "particular nationalist discussion and not recognize from whence it comes. He is not a garden variety nationalist who has not grappled over his life with complex issues of class, patriarchy, gender, and so on," unquote. West then tries to butter up Professor Clarke by saying, quote, "It is very easy at times for people to invoke the name John Henrik Clarke because he is so well and rightfully respected and not understand the fire, the brook of fire through which he has come. He had to, as a senior intellectual freedom fighter, to engage Marx and Engels and Lenin right across the board, as well as to be a radical democratic thinker. Is that fair to say?" he asked Dr. Clarke. Dr. Clarke is gentle as he tries to address the issue of racial identity with a person he can clearly see has problems in this area. "Well, that's fair," unquote, said Clarke. "But remember, I was born in Union Springs, Alabama, the son of a sharecropper." Clarke goes on to tell how his father made $14 a week and how on one day after he had made $18 in a week, his father had lectured Clarke on the value of hard work. Dr. Clarke goes on to contrast his father's viewpoint with his own observations. It is said that if two people agree on everything all the time, one of the people is not thinking. Dr. Clarke, even at that early age, was certainly thinking. Clarke tells how he saw people who were hardly working and doing pretty well, and other people who were working hard and not making much. Clarke describes how his leaving home at age 14 because he could not get along with his stepmother had led him to have many experiences among his own people, poor people, that gave him insights into the inequities of the system. In his youth, Clarke was indeed a member of the Young Communist League, and by his own account, he was an associate of the Communist Party for 50 years. However, Dr. Clarke makes it clear by his disclosures to West regarding Clarke's own childhood observations of the inequities that it was these observations that are the source of his class consciousness and not the Europeans with which he would have later association. Clarke takes care to credit the Communist Party with giving him a place from which he could refine his own observations and analysis. He takes care to say that he never joined the Communist Party. He tells West how he used the tools of analysis he gained and eventually turned that analysis on the communists themselves with whom he had associated. He says this led the communists to kick him out of their circle. In case West had missed Clarke's subtle points regarding identity and development, Dr. Clarke spells it out for West saying, quote, "I am a nationalist. I am unapologetic about it. I've had associations with all kinds of people. I have loved all kinds of people. I have appreciated the help of all kinds of people, but first and foremost, above all things, I'm devoted to the ultimate liberation of my own people," unquote. The debate is really over at this point, but unfortunately for West, he couldn't leave it alone. West desperately offered what could be called in psychiatric terminology resistance to insight. This is perhaps what makes Dr. Clarke decide to eventually invoke shock therapy. West says in response to Clarke's remarks regarding Clarke's own nationalism, quote, "That raises a question of peoplehood versus nationhood," says West. "Because you see," said West, "I believe that people of African descent are a distinct people and an extension of African people." West goes on, "But one can believe in distinct peoplehood and not infer that what follows is nationhood." Clarke, by this point, convinced that the audience was ready for his interpretation, delivered a concise remark perfectly timed to give West the joke he deserved. and to give the audience immediate insight as to what force propelled West's feet and mouth. Said Dr. Clarke, you would not say that to an Israeli. From out of nowhere, bang, you would not say that to an Israeli. Dr. Clarke had hit both West and the audience with high voltage insight. And for those who don't believe West felt the electrical current, consider the following fact. West's next 4 words consisted of the single word I, stuttered in rapid succession. I. It was like he had stepped on Granville Wood's third rail. So busy with the double talk, West had never seen Dr. Clarke slip on the electrodes. Dr. John Henrik Clarke, master psychiatrist.